What I've actually done is I got from the Commission on Ethics website sort of a primer, because just reading the Code of Ethics is kind of painful. It includes both the Sunshine Law and the Code of Ethics and a few additional laws, whistleblower acts, things that have some applicability to the discussions that we had. So hopefully those will get down and you can digest them before the next meeting. I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about.
Oh, we have enough to talk about without doing that. And Alan has a piece in regard to the ethics anyway.
You have a copy of it too.
Okay.
Oh, I do?
I'm going to call the meeting to order now and ask for the roll call.
Barbara Craig,
Here.
John Jenkins. Here. Omar Dorr,
Here.
Jackie McCurdy,
Here.
Chris Corey,
Here.
Jesse Purdon. Here. Alan Horowitz,
Here.
Robert Donaldson, Russ Wynn.
Here.
Thank you. Yes.
Would it be possible to, just a refresher on whose appointment, council-wise? I know the mayor appointed you, I know that, right? And we know Mike Gibson appointed me, but just out of curiosity, because of the fact that there's gonna be suggestions coming specifically to the board, that's tied to some mentality to a council member, so who that is would be nice to know.
Jesse, you are actually all sitting in the district seat that you were
Okay,
appointed by.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. That's how it was.
I didn't know
Easiest
that.
to
That makes it
clarify.
easy, too.
I didn't
No,
realize
no.
that. That's interesting.
Yep.
No, I knew that. That's how
Yeah.
you were seated.
Appreciate it.
Okay. Can I have approval of the minutes for February 11th? Or
Motion to approve?
do I have a second? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Minutes are approved. Now, how long will it be, do you think, before you need your papers before we start?
I can start answering some of the questions from the last meeting. It's just some of the materials and one of the draft changes that you requested. I'm going to get printouts so you can distribute and read
Yeah.
those.
I was looking at, we asked you about section 13C,
And that's one of the changes I made.
so we'll wait until your paper. What can you discuss on this?
Well, some of the questions the preliminary questions, and I have a list, and we went over some outstanding issues. One of the ones that, I'll go in order, sorry.
Yeah, I have some answers too.
The questions with respect to section 15,
Yes,
these were the violations,
spending limits,
spending limit violations, reporting violations, also what provisions, whether or not we could add additional provisions into the charter. So I did some research on that, and there is a whole chapter of state law dedicated to voting issues. So I looked through that. None of that really applies. That would be everything from tearing up votes to fake voter issues, and each one of those has its own set of rules. When it came to candidates, candidate reporting, contributions, PACs, the general rule is that a violation, a first-time violation, is treated as a first-degree misdemeanor. Now, the legislatures actually changed the penalties for that, but with respect to these violations, a first-degree misdemeanor is punishable by up to a year in prison and generally by a $1,000 fine. An additional change the legislature added is up to $10,000 when it's the case of a corporation or a PAC in this case. A second or more violation raises it to a third-degree felony, which is up to 5 years imprisonment and $10,000 fine or $50,000 fine if it's a corporation. Now, with respect to what ability the local governments have to add additional limitations, there's nothing in the state law regarding county and municipal offices for spending limits. There are spending limits like $3,000 for the governor and lower appointments. But the balance of the election code, chapter 106, and in some opinions by the Attorney General, does clearly seem to preempt those issues to the state. So when it comes to us coming up with our own reporting criteria and the like, I think that really the city is limited to only putting those contribution limits in, because that would be a stricter interpretation, and it doesn't step on the toes of the
the state.
legislature. And, because the legislature not only just has volumes of statutes, it also has a great deal of administrative code. And although I didn't see anything that strictly preempted, when you have that level of a legal regime, generally the courts look to it as it's an indirect preemption, that it's covering so many bases that you're frustrating the purposes of the state by creating your own sets of rules. And of course, our elections get processed and reporting is done through other constitutional officers like the supervisor of elections. So, you know, maybe if you guys had specific questions, I might be able to
Well,
look at that more narrowly.
in
but-
other words, couldn't we just say we have a violation? Couldn't we just go to the state?
Yeah, if someone
Rather
violates
than-
the rules, it's a violation of state law.
It's a violation no matter what.
Yeah, and the other issue is, again, there's only so many violations that we have authority as a local government to charge, you know, giving someone a parking ticket, or code enforcement lien against their property. How would we enforce violations
Right.
against a to-be candidate? So it becomes very difficult. Really, the state avenue is the appropriate vessel.
Question?
Additionally, I would say that I've had people say to me that it's unconstitutional for us to even do the individual district restrictions. And I don't agree necessarily, but I'm just saying we could probably do more harm than good if we actually tried to push them on something that's really left to the state. I think
Right.
we could have unforeseen consequences if we shake that tree, because I don't know necessarily that we have a lot behind us in regards to saying you can only spend X amount of dollars in 2, 4, or 6. I'm not sure we're standing on firm legs to begin with, so I would just be cautious against doing that, and I would agree with Derek on his assessment that it's really a state.
So, but Derek, are you saying what we have now in terms of a campaign limit?
Oh, no, what we have now is valid.
That's valid.
Yeah.
It's so much per registered
Based on
voter?
population.
Right, and at in the last meeting, we didn't have a discussion about what other items you might want to put into the charter, but just the general discussion of could we regulate PACs separately? That's where I think we're going outside the bounds.
Are there any?
Barbara, would you like to speak?
Yes, I would like to speak. Are there any limits in the law now that say that people must report the PAC spending?
Yes.
Are there any limits on the amount of PAC money that they can take in from a specific source or totally?
It depends on the office, but generally the PAC limits are the same as the regular individual contribution limits. There are rules for calculating indirect contributions, and so that would be the throwing of, you know, events, signage, things like that. Those all get calculated per statutory amount, and those get reported as well as in-kind contributions.
Is that something that is the same for every district candidate? Since the districts are assumedly somewhat equal, I would assume that's the case if it's based on the number of voters.
Are you speaking with respect to our charter provision on it?
Well, our charter or the state or whatever is the existing law. So, I guess I kind of want to know where are we in the law in terms of what's limited from PACs and what's limited in terms of what an individual candidate can spend, so we can see if it makes sense to put further limits on or whether we're in a...
We have,
I don't know the answer to that
right,
question. so I
we
just-
have the charter has a limitation based on per person calculation leading up to effectively a maximum that can be spent. I'm sorry, I'm looking for that.
That includes the PAC
Sec-
money.
15, yeah.
Page
that's
18.
15.
Well, depending on how you quantify PAC money.
Yeah, PAC to street is an individual.
The PAC
And
is
that's the same way it is at county levels and other cities. PACs and individuals are all treated the same. So the maximum cap is not more than $1 per registered voter in the place is the campaign.
That's for referendum
Yeah,
questions.
I'm looking,
To
sorry.
we as candidates.
Yeah. No candidate for a council member seat may spend more than $2 per registered voter in his or her district. as of the preceding general election. No candidate for mayor may spend more than $2 per registered voter as of the preceding municipal general election in the city on an election. So that's what it's based on, and then the cap is adjusted thereafter on a consumer price index.
Would you like to speak on that?
Well, I just want to say with PACs, just to be fully clear, people are saying, is that money quantified? Yes, to an extent, what Derek said is correct. It is quantified, and you're going to see it on the sheets when they turn it in, so you'll be able to see if a PAC donated to them. But it's not going to be a special thing. That's not how it is reported, so I don't want to. Yes, he was correct in how he did it, but I just want you guys to fully understand that's not how it works. And then further, PACs themselves realistically do a lot of the work outside of the campaigns. So to say, am I counting all of the dollars from the PACs? Yes, that sounds good to say
But you're not.
as a talking point, but that's really and truly not how it works. So
Yeah.
I just want to make that clear so everybody really understands. Saying, yeah, I'm going to regulate PACs. Okay, I'm going to put a PAC that says I'm going to only spend $1,000. They do that, but then they turn around and they spend 10 grand however they want. But there's no way to regulate that.
Right,
So,
what Mr. Purdon's pointing out to is if they spend money on a general campaign issue and it's not being contributed to a candidate, then there's no tracking system for that.
So, and I'm fine with that. I just want to make sure that you understand, because Barbara, the way you asked it, it was almost as if, hey, are we going to be able to see this as a separate item? And maybe I misunderstood.
Well, my understanding is there are two ways that the PAC money is spent. One is in direct contributions to candidates.
Right.
And the other is what's called uncoordinated expenditures, where they spend it on their own, supposedly without working with the candidate, although that's often quite a fiction. So what I was trying to get at, the question I asked is, of that money that is donated to the candidate specifically, is there a limit on that?
Yes.
Okay, so, I mean, I know what the limit is nationally, but I don't know what it is locally. And then to say, is there any limit on uncoordinated expenditures, or can any PAC spend anything it wants to, so long as it does not coordinate with the candidate?
The PACs can spend whatever they are allowed to spend under Chapter 106 in the Election Code. So basically, they report to the state. The simplest way to, and I can send it out to you, having worked on a school board PAC last session. The Department of State puts out a pretty good set of guidelines on the reporting criteria, who's reporting, who's responsible, what it can be spent on, and then you got to compare that with the IRS regulations, because many of these are 501c6s. They're set up and they have to be operating continuously, and there's only so much money that can go percentage towards lobbying. Others have to be spent on. So it's a very complex web. At the local level, what I would say is, from the last meeting, you asked me to look at a lot of the neighboring charters. And so I completed a review of our neighboring community charters, and I'm starting to look a little more far afield. Most of the limits on campaign contributions to individual candidates have been limited at a strict dollar amount, $500, $1,000. It hasn't been as complicated a system as what Bonita has currently.
Can I ask one more question to
Yes.
follow up on this? Is the amount that the PAC contribution is, does that count towards the $2 per registered voter? So the maximum you can spend is whatever money you want to stick in yourself or your friends give you, plus the PACs can't be more than $2 per registered voter? Or is,
Well, if they submit it to the candidate.
and that's a specific question I'm asking.
And then the other issue is that the way the charter's written is it may spend, not raise. So that's another issue in there. And I think that I didn't go back and look at the minutes to see how that was done, but I suspect part of the reason why it was spend is it's very difficult to control how much money you raise, given all the various avenues. You may have online contributions and things, so it's, how you coordinate that it stops here and I can't take any more money. But spending money is something that would be in control of the campaign. So the limit in the charter right now is spend, not raise.
Yes?
Just point of clarification. I don't necessarily think, what you're asking, I don't want to say he's wrong, but it is the part of the dollars that's actually counted that is into the equation. Because you're getting a dollar amount based on the amount of people who are in it. So that's going to be a different that's a different dollar amount than what you're going to get outside of that, and you can't quantify what's outside of that. So yes, maybe $1,000 but there's 10,000 you don't. So I just want you to be clear with that, because
Now, completely confused.
No, that didn't clear it up. That did not clear it
Derek,
up.
do you understand?
No.
You get what I'm saying?
Yeah,
No.
I think Mr. Purdon's going back to his earlier comment, which is we can control what
What
the
goes to
candidates
candidate,
have.
but not
We can't control the
non-coordinated.
PACs or anything else.
I understand that. Okay,
And
that's-
Barbara, I think you understand that.
Yeah,
now.
I do understand the
Yeah.
non-coordinated, only,
Right.
Yeah.
I was just trying to figure out if the maximum amount that could be spent of $2 per voter included any source of money that
It
was given
does.
to the candidate, and that appears to
And
be.
it does,
It does. Okay.
yes. Any other comments on this section I'd like to? What other section did you look?
We're still waiting for the language on 21C.
Well, then, if we're still waiting, then we should get rid of whatever we're going to do with this section.
On 15?
Are we going to do anything or nothing? You know, because that's what we were asking. Is it something that you want to address to change? My option would be not to change it, because we know how it works, and you're not going to get the PACs, and, you know, what you want to do, you're not going to get.
My concern is that there's something called inflation that happens, and we have in law something that seems to be at $2 per voter, and I wonder if that
Oh, that's
honestly reflects what the changing cost would be from whenever that limit was placed in. Ordinarily, you need to look at what the reality of well, today, the way most people campaign here is those shiny things that they send to everyone's mailbox, knocking on doors, holding neighborhood meetings. I don't think it's,
Signs.
what?
Signs, too.
Signs
Signs
which
are
have gone
big.
up in expense. So I guess the question I would have as to whether you want to increase the amount that you can spend per voter to reflect the reality of the cost of elections. And I've never run an election here, so I don't know if that's needed. I'd kind of like to have some
No,
feedback
that's
from.
a good point.
from
John?
I just wonder if the city attorney found any other local municipalities that have a similar per voter dollar amount and what that might be.
No one locally. I haven't expanded, you know, what ends up happening is, I'm sure it's fairly obvious, different parts of the state tend to all have a little bit of groupthink. And so you'll find that, in particular, some of the older cities will also have, like, reviewing the charters of all the Lee County cities. Fort Myers, by far, has the longest and the most storied set of charter because it's the oldest city and it's evolved many times, whereas all the remaining cities divested from Lee County, you know, fairly recently, so they all have very similar charters. So, and Collier's pretty much the same situation. So I haven't, there's no way to search them globally except by going and kind of asking around and getting piecemeal. So I haven't found anyone who does it a per district, per voter calculation, where effectively there is a moving target every election saying this is the amount that you can cap on. Everyone else does, 500 or 1,000. Most of the counties do 1,000. They've moved up from 500 in the last few years. So, and that's just per contributor. Those are the limits. Otherwise, it's
Oh,
uncapped.
per contributor.
Per
we're talking
contributor.
fixed
Fixed dollar amount per
Yeah.
contributor.
But now we're apple and oranging, aren't we? We're talking on the one side,
Yeah,
how much
and-
you can spend, and the other is how much you can earn, so.
Correct.
Or bring in. So I guess my question would be, based on the fact that Lee County, a bunch of us went off from Lee County, and you would assume in something like this, we'd have similar provisions, and yet I'm hearing you say that they don't have that provision. That makes me wonder, where on earth did this come from?
The charter group that was working on the election. You know, that's where it
Is
came
that where it
from.
came from?
I feel like this is probably organic to the city of Bonita Springs. I don't,
Yeah,
There
I
may be-
think
there may
that
be
it's
other ones out
just
there.
a group, and they said, oh, let's make it
You know,
$1
just
or
out of the
$2.
sky?
Yes, yes.
Does that mean then that, that we have a larger amount that you can spend if you do $2 times the total number of voters, which I have no idea what each district has, or is $1,000 a greater amount?
it's uncapped in most other jurisdictions. So
So you can spend
if you
anything
had,
want.
if you were in Lee County and you were running for a Lee County race, or I'll go with any other county, especially when they're elected countywide like they are in Lee County, well, I mean, there's 700,000 people, a significant hundreds of thousands of elected, of voters. If each of them contributed, you could have, you could have campaigns that exceeded $1 million based on a $1,000 contribution limit. We have put a cap on the total that can be spent. So I think you're right, it's apples and oranges, it's impossible to
Yeah.
calculate. It's a policy decision. We have one philosophy on it, other communities have a different philosophy.
Is there any feedback from the current council as to whether that's an adequate amount or
No,
there's?
but we could discuss that with
Yeah.
them when we have a meeting with them.
I think that would be an important thing to ask.
think
'Cause
so,
I mean,
too.
I personally don't have any experience as to whether that's constraining or more than liberal. I just don't know.
We can start preparing a draft of the items that you want to address with them, and we'll put bullet points together, so
Yes.
we can create our agenda prior to meeting, with the joint
Good.
meeting.
That would definitely be one.
Madam Secretary, can I
Yes.
just, I really apologize to everyone. I missed last week, and just, is there a copy of the actual code? Because I'm looking at changes to make to it here, and I just,
Didn't get the
Didn't
would
you
be-
get a booklet?
I may have, but I
If
don't
you wanna
think
see
I
that, here's a charter.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh,
May I make a statement?
yes.
I really don't care how much a candidate spends on their elections. Whatever money, to me, money equals free speech. What I do object to is the amount of dark money that comes into these elections, supposedly uncoordinated, but we all know it's not. And so that if it would appreciably help the situation to have an unlimited campaign amount, such that the PACs, primarily from developers, don't feel that they have to hide their contributions from the public in terms of who they're supporting. And they're the ones that normally produce the political slicks and everything else that clog the mailboxes. Then I would be fine with saying, fine, just go ahead and spend as much as you want, but don't run the fiction that you're uncoordinated with the PACs that are supplying the money.
On that, I think you could have all the money in the world that you could spend on an election, but that you're going to have dark money that comes in, because they're not going to give it in the open, because that shows that they're for somebody and they'll get something back. I was in the legislature in the 60s, and I'll tell you, it hasn't changed a bit since. And it really hasn't. And, I'm not saying you shouldn't have all the money or whatever to spend, but don't kid yourself. They're going to be dark monies that are available.
Well, and it's important to recognize that any electioneering communications, whether it's signage, websites, anything like that, is going to have, that comes from a PAC. It still has to have a paid for by
Yep,
this group.
yep.
So, if the PAC is supporting a particular candidate, it becomes obvious who's paying for that, for transparency purposes.
Yeah.
Madam, may I be recognized?
Yes.
I would like to say that I agree with the gentleman to my right that honestly, I've always felt it's semi-unconstitutional for us to restrict it anyways, because I'm big on freedom of speech. I don't think it should be restricted. So if we think it will help open it up completely, but we have to recognize the fact that PAC, that's not going to we're not, it's not gonna be PAC reform, so we shouldn't give ourselves a sticker thinking that's the case. But it's a good step to opening it up completely so that we're consistent with our neighboring municipalities and we're consistent in regards to the First Amendment. So I'm okay with that.
What about keeping people that don't have as much money from running
No,
when
no,
you
they should be.
That's
have,
what I
an-
wanted.
when you have a general, anybody can spend anything they want?
It's valid. No, that's
Yeah.
valid. I mean, I'm not saying it's not.
Yeah, Madam Secretary, can I just make a point?
I'm,
Oh, sorry.
Madam Chair,
Oh, Madam Chair, sorry.
that's all
Madam
right.
Chair. Yeah, we have communities in Bonita Springs that are very, very different socioeconomic classes. And while I'm all for freedom of speech, I don't want a situation where we have a few neighborhoods in Bonita Springs that can radically override other neighborhoods with their ability to speak because of the amount of money they have. So,
Why
yeah.
can't they now, though?
Well, now we have the spending limit amount.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, I'm not as familiar with the PAC situation, but when it comes to spending, you know, yeah, there's neighborhoods and there's districts where there is not a lot of wealth in that district, and I wouldn't want people from other districts starting a campaign there because they simply have more money.
That's valid, too.
Any other comments on this?
So right now, we have no changes, but a discussion still on a total cap versus a contribution limit.
Correct, correct. Well, he's going to look up those for us, so we'll have it next time.
And then we'll also place this as a placeholder for your
And we're
joint
going
meeting.
to have a talk with the council before we would vote on it.
Interesting one.
I don't know how interesting, but we're going to have it.
Well, you may also want to consider a hybrid, where you keep a cap, but you also put a contribution
I
limit.
can't hear you, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I'm sorry. You may also want to consider a hybrid where you put a contribution limit into the cap.
Yeah,
So the whole cap is not met by just a few large donors, but smaller donors get, you know, equal voice.
yeah, if you could,
I'll get
Do
you a list of
something-
all the
yeah.
caps, and
Give
I'll
us the
expand it to
option.
like a 7-county area or something like that, so you have a little more range than just what's in Lee County.
good.
So we've three handouts in front of you. One, the biggest packet, that's for your light reading. That's effectively a primer put out by the Commission on Ethics. And quite frankly, this is a lot easier to read, and it's broken down into more simpler sections than trying to read the actual statutes in Chapter 112. But this covers two areas we discussed at the last meeting. One was the requirements for public meetings, for notices and public meetings. So the provisions of this packet that deal with the Sunshine Law generally, which I'm pretty sure everybody has some familiarity with, which is that, you know, if there's a meeting of more than one member of a collegial body, then it has to be noticed. Some of the guidance in here about what that notice means effectively has to be reasonable notice, which prior to hurricane could be 12 hours. For something like an ordinance, there's actual statutory provisions, which is the second larger attachment I gave you. You asked specifically about the notice requirements for things like land use items. Rather than, and people have tried, but I've never seen anyone actually come up with like a logic table that explains when and what occurs in what order. There are effectively 3 sets of rules when it comes to the adoption of ordinances and land use provisions. One is the standard adoption of an ordinance, and this would be an ordinance whether it's respective to BSU's franchise or whether it's respective to a code enforcement issue, and that is that there's a first reading, and then there's an adoption of the ordinance at a public hearing and at a second time, so many days after it's been advertised. So that's standard for all ordinances. When it comes to land use, they fall into 2 categories. The first category, and I've highlighted all those areas in here so you can read for yourself, but as a summary, the first category is when it's the property owner themselves making the request. And that's because if you're the property owner, you know, you don't need as much notice to change your own property entitlements. So there is a meeting and there's an advertisement process for it, but it's a single public hearing. It's basically adopted in a similar manner as to a regular ordinance. The notice provisions may be a little more different depending on the size of the property. It may get individualized notice, and our code has some rules about individualized notice. Also, it's a display advertisement showing the portion of the city that is being rezoned. But in the second situation, and this is where it's a city-initiated rezoning, or it is a initiation or rezoning that affects the classes of uses citywide. So this would be, we are changing the rules regulating car washes in all commercial districts. So it's something of wide application. In those situations, it's required to have 2 public hearings and additional notices. So 2 advertisements, 2 public hearings, so that the property owners who may not have knowledge of the change have that additional notice on top of it. Now, that's just the statutory rules. As you've seen in the charter, we have some other rules about notice. We have, after we've adopted something, we have notice provisions. That's where we deviate. So you asked for what are the standard rules? These are the standard rules. You know, my recommendation when you're comparing these later on is more notice is good. Individualized notice as far as mailings is usually the way most cities go to make sure that people have that additional notice within a certain sphere. But when you deviate from the state laws, you also run the risk of confusion. And we talked about the last meeting, what happens if we don't advertise the fact that we've adopted an ordinance in the past? Does that invalidate the ordinance? That's a question of law that will be Bonita specific. And we just think about what the cost of that extra advertising and what was the purpose of it. I'm not really sure. But those are, so you asked for what the ground rules are, and you see what we have in the charter, and just thought I'd get you that information. And then the third attachment is the request you made to clarify section 21. And I took a look at this. I know the 2 requests were to clarify the 180-day provision and to use more positive language. When I started tinkering with it, I came at it with the eye of how can I make the least number of changes and make it clear for everyone. And so what I did was I struck out all the provisions regarding the deputy mayor temporarily relinquishing control of his district, because that didn't seem to make sense to me. Does that mean that now there's a vacancy in a city council and then we have to have 2 special elections? There was a lot of things that were just internally inconsistent. So the way it reads now is if there's any vacancy on the council, mayor or a council member, and it's within 180 days of a general election, no special election is called. If it's outside that scope, a special election will be called. All the other rules apply. For the mayor, I just made it simple. The deputy mayor will take over until that seat is filled. So that seemed to be the quickest way to get us to the same result without as much confusing language. And honestly, I don't think it really makes a difference except for that last previous sentence. The deputy mayor shall temporarily relinquish his or her office as council member and shall assume the office of mayor for the period of time until the new mayor is seated. Relinquishing his office sort of made it circular and like there was a vacancy.
But if he doesn't relinquish his office, there's a vacancy on the council.
Well, it becomes a vacancy on the council when he relinquishes his office. There's still a vacancy on the council. There's still 1 seat missing.
Yeah, but you can do something with it. I mean, you can have an election or you can...
Well, but you're going to solve that problem when you have the special election to replace the mayor. The mayor comes in
Okay.
and he goes back to his seat.
Deputy mayor is only serving until the election.
Right, he's
And-
only serving till the
And
election.
he will serve as deputy mayor and in his seat.
And then go
Right.
back to his-
Okay.
So he
you
basically, he
still
becomes the
have the-
presiding officer of the council until such time as, and that seemed to be the most appropriate change.
Well, wait, right now, sorry.
Yeah, go right ahead.
So right now, the citizens vote for the mayor. The
Mhm.
mayor appoints a deputy mayor. So now potentially you'd have someone acting as mayor that was not voted into that role by the city. So I guess I would have a little bit of a issue with that.
Well, only because the mayor would otherwise be indisposed. So this is,
Yeah.
this is if the mayor's seat is vacant.
Yeah.
You would have to have, otherwise you wouldn't have anyone to
Until the
fill
next-
that role.
Until they have an election.
So it almost seems like the language that existed previously, although I don't think this was the intent, created two vacancies. It created a vacancy in the district, and it created a vacancy in the mayor. And what I get concerned about is that that confusion may lead to two special elections in which the deputy mayor, who is just taking over the role temporarily, actually may lose his seat.
That's
Yeah.
wrong again.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
an illogical reaction, but if someone wanted to challenge and say that that's the way the charter is, I wouldn't want to take that unnecessary risk.
Yeah. Madam Chair, one other
Yes.
question. Just, so I'm somewhat unfamiliar with it, but I think in the last cycle, there was a vote where council members or mayor can't serve beyond 2 consecutive terms. If there is more than 180 days out and someone is voted in for a partial term, does that mean that that person does the partial term and then 2 terms? Or is it no more than 8 years, in which case they would really only serve 1 elected term if they wanted to keep running?
Madam Chair.
1 minute. He's asking
Yeah.
Derek.
The temporary part doesn't count.
Yeah, it does read that. I think it's section 18, and then the most recent adoption, which was last fall. We're going to point to the exact language. So in the last sentence of section 18 in your books,
Section 18,
Section 18. If a vacancy occurs, shall become, this is again to the deputy mayor, shall become mayor for the remainder of the unexpired term if less than 180 days. And then it recites down to section 21C. And that's the section just went over. Is there another section?
Lord knows where 18 is. What
This
page
looks like
is
you do fill that seat.
18, which
It does.
one are you looking for?
Where 18 is it?
18 is on
Yeah,
page
what-
9.
6, I believe.
6?
621C is where it shows that you would fill that
I think it's in section
vacancy
13 on the
that
term
where the
limits,
deputy
where they
mayor
added
became
Yeah,
mayor.
that's the
You would
last
fill that with
section,
someone.
Yeah, but he's looking at
18.
18.
C, I think is where it
He's
is.
also looking at 21C.
Printed out.
18's on
Okay, thank you. 18's on 19.
And, hold on, give us 1 second. There's one other position. All right, so the most recent amendments, which were in 2018, will take you to section 13. This is the actual term limits provision.
Last sentence is C.
Meg pointed out the last sentence of C, the foregoing limitation shall apply to all current and prior elected mayor or council members. The foregoing limitation shall not apply to succession or election to fill a vacancy in a term of office for a period of less than 2 years. So that doesn't get tacked
Yeah.
on.
So that's good.
Now, I will, now that we looked at 18, I'm going to look at possibly revising that last sentence in section 18, because that, again, it's somewhat duplicative, but I don't want to make sure it doesn't change anything what we're looking at in 21C, where it talks about the deputy mayor stepping in. So I'll confirm that.
Okay. So we won't vote on that.
Do we know what it is?
I think yes, John.
Well, Madam Chair, for my part, it's hard for me to listen to Derek, look at
Yeah,
his
you've only had a moment to read it,
edits,
so.
Look at the old version, but I'd be happy to study all this and come back at our next meeting and be prepared to take some action on it. So
Yeah.
And again, I'm sorry,
Time
I
if
meant to get
there's-
this stuff to you.
That's all right. If there's any other,
No.
tweaks to other sections that would be
Yeah, I think
required
we
to
have
affect
to hear
this.
all this and then take it home and look at it. Yeah.
When you've got a long list of other items, too.
Well, I know, I've got the other items here, so. All right, we did 15.
Just going down to the next list of items, there were a couple other things you asked me to look at quickly. The debt limit of our neighboring cities. I didn't find that any city had a debt limit placed in its charter. Now, I will continue to search out beyond, local and neighboring cities, but nobody had a debt limit that was placed in its charter. Some had debt provisions placed in their codes, but not in the charter itself.
Could you give me the section that
That
is-
was section 46F.
Yes, okay.
Can I ask a question about that one?
Yes, Barbara.
That if it's not set in the charter, who sets it? Is it just by ordinance of the council? Or is there just no limit?
It can be set by ordinance of the council. There are
Are there state law provisions?
There are some state law provisions regarding putting away, making sure there's reserve funds. The other situation you deal with is that you will have, if there's significant borrowing or bonding capacity, there will be limitations and anti-dilution clauses in those specific enactments. But as far as whether there's a requirement to have a debt policy in a charter, no.
Next.
Next section was to see whether or not the section 47 language,
Yes,
which was,
from 3 to 5 years?
right, I couldn't find out where that came from. It's not in, I did some searching around. I found that similar provisions were placed in other cities, it's a minority of cities in the state of Florida. Also, similar provisions were placed throughout the country in a lot of city charters, and I suspect that that was an addition based on that requirement. There are some appropriation languages in other charters that I saw with respect to specific appropriations carrying over, but the 3 to 5 year issue, I couldn't find where that came from at all. Not in state law and not in any requirements that I'm aware of. I'll keep looking into the issue to see if I can find out the history from our adoption history, but I think what I'm gonna have to do
I
is,
think that should be on the list for the council meeting.
Yes, I think so
Mhm.
too. It would be nice to know what purpose that serves.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what the purpose is. and
Right.
You can't really decide what to do if you don't know.
well, and I found some
If we take
cities,
it away, will anything happen?
I
Leave it
found
in,
some
does anything
cities, I
happen?
found some cities that had it in their enabling legislation. So when the special acts were created establishing those cities,
Yeah.
in Florida, Palm City, another small city had it. And I tried to look into the legislative history to understand where I could find that from. And it doesn't seem to be any more than somebody saw it somewhere else and cut and pasted in there. I mean, there was no
John?
legislative history on it.
Well, this just sort of brings to mind a process issue or question I've had with what we're doing here. As we go through this, I feel like we've got our charter, we've got this other list of issues. There's really no authority for that. It's just suggestions made by council members or others. And then we've talked about, I guess, what, taking a vote on what may be required that our committee agrees should be addressed as a proposed charter change. But for the most part, I think what I'm starting to see is we're identifying issues that we think might be of concern to the citizens or to the council members, and we're starting to make a list of those. And so I'm feeling more comfortable that if we can identify those, no one is being required to then advocate that we need to make a charter change with whether or not we've got the language here, but we're sort of building and identifying the issues that at some point in months to come we'll identify as a group that we either recommend to the city council to change or not. But I'm just trying to figure out how to get comfortable with where we are on this group of issues.
These were given, most of them were given to us by a council member. And we're looking in to see how, find out what we can about it. It wasn't given to us by the council. It was either a person that sent it in or a council person.
And I'm assuming that
So we're trying to get our hands on it
Mhm.
and have enough things that we can talk to the council about and get their opinion, and the other ones we'll have to use our own opinion.
And you're not limited to these two. These were just the initial, as a starting
Right.
point,
Right.
that we had the one-on-one meetings and some feedback from
And I'm
them.
hopeful that maybe we get some members of the public to attend eventually, or we get some other suggested issues to look at in the charter by, from the community.
I just
So-
think that's the most important thing you've said. Honestly, I think it's I mean that at this time, because we really need the citizens to get involved. And if they're out there watching TV or listening, they really should get involved in this because it affects their whole life here in Bonita.
And I guess what I'm saying is, I like the direction we're going now. We're
Yeah.
sort of building this list of issues, we'll get some input on those. I don't feel like, without seeing specific charter language, I need to vote yea or nay on a charter amendment, but we're making progress knocking out some of these issues that have been identified and looking for others that might be of interest.
Right?
Madam Chairman,
Yes.
what you said is really thought-provoking. And does the committee feel it's within their power to go out and be proactive and go out into the community, go to HOA meetings or go to those kind of things and just listen to the public if anybody's interested? I mean, that's a big undertaking if we would choose to do it, but that would be a way to get the public. I don't think very many people watch us on TV.
Oh, I don't think so either.
No,
I got a haircut.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
is there an appropriate time to submit ideas, and does it go directly to you, or are we gonna do it later in the meeting today, or should I be submitting?
It goes
via
to
email?
Arlene.
Okay.
So some of your members have already, they forwarded some ideas to us, which we incorporated in the review here. So you can forward that to us, and we add them to the list as highlighted. What we didn't do is identify specific folks' names. who's-
No.
The reason I ask is because I have about 4, but 3 of those came from directly, when I ran for city council this last term, it was issues that came directly to me from people involved in the process. And full disclosure, me and Greg DeWitt, the guy who barely beat me by 64, him and I are friends.
Yeah.
We talk often, and I think these are things he would even agree with me on, and it's just transparency things and participation things with the
Fine,
community. So-
just hand them in to Arlene,
Well,
and
we'll
they'll
add
be
them.
on our agenda the next time.
Great.
Additionally.
And maybe you could, if you could, send them out a little earlier
Mm-hmm.
so that we could have time to look at the section and all that. Getting back to you, Alan, I think we have the right to go out into the community. And I think it really is the right thing to do. I mean, I talk to everybody I see somewhere in the evening. I mention this, and they're like, what? You know, you have to get them interested.
Would you, I'm guessing you would not have a problem, for example, in my case, if I sent a note to the head of our HOA to say, hey, do you have any issues that are on your agenda that are burning that you need to see a charter change? And have that dialogue. Is that an issue?
It's fine.
Okay.
That's absolutely fine.
That's
Madam
fine.
Chair,
Yes.
just to follow up on what Alan said, because I think that's a very, very good idea. Again, people just aren't going to come out here. What about, with the sunshine law situation, would it be possible if a couple of members decided, can we, and if we outwardly disclose it here, is there a method to have a few members get together? If we can get like an HOA where we know we're going to have a few hundred people there, or we can get a big meeting?
The best method to do that would for us to assist with a workshop.
Okay.
And then you'd have the ability to have a workshop. You could have it here at
Okay.
City Hall or at the high school, and we would advertise it and record it so that
Okay.
it was publicly noticed for you all to be there. That's,
Great.
May I speak to
yes.
that too? I want to speak to Alan's point. Public outreach, I think, is an excellent idea, but it will be useless unless we can frame what the questions that we're asking and give context and reasons for why this change might be useful or not. And I think that's what we're trying to do now, and I think that was your point, that we're trying to find out what in the charter needs changing, why it needs changing, what the benefit would be from it being changed to the citizen. I mean, that's who we really want to benefit. But I think to just go out and say, do you want some changes to the charter? You'll have, those glazed eyes rolling back. I rather imagine, other than us here, there probably aren't 10 people in the city of Bonita Springs who've read the charter or would have any clue really what the point of the charter is. So I think those are great ideas and educational, but I think we have a lot more work to do before we're ready to do
Yeah,
that.
but we have to know if we can do it.
Yep, but
after
that-
we
yeah,
do
that's-
the
I think
work.
that's
And
excellent.
yes, we can.
And
Right.
when you get closer to the framework of the actual amendments as part of the charge of the Charter Review Committee, you will host, at least 2 public hearings with different intervals and time. That's part of when you're further along in the process. But if the committee so chose, as you have some more framework and you wanted feedback from the committee on that framework, you can have an interim workshop as well.
Thank you. All right. Derek, do you have,
I do. I have a couple other items. So the section 47, that, as I indicated, that
Right.
one relates back to, that was part of the special act incorporating the city. I've been able to figure out where they pulled that language from or any specific reason why it was included. However, having been involved in the incorporation of the village of Estero, I know we just cut and paste from Bonita Springs, and so it wasn't like, there's not a lot of thought given into these things sometimes. The other item that came up at the request of Ms. Craig was looking at the height limitation, and specifically the city of the city of Naples, who has a height limitation, how that worked in their charter. The city attorney, Mr. Pritt, has retired, but I have left messages, and hopefully he'll get back to me, but I have looked into it, and to clarify what we discussed the last meeting, the height limitation that is in the city of Naples is actually a limitation only on commercial buildings, not on residential along the coast. And something that I would not recommend is in their charter, they actually tied it to specific zoning districts, which means that I could just change the name of a zoning district and suddenly it doesn't apply anymore. So there was, that I haven't researched whether that was citizen initiative driven or that was a charter review or how that came about. Hopefully I'll get all that information to give you that background. But I think just dovetailing on my responses to the last meeting is the language you use can be interpreted multiple ways. And so in the case of the city of Naples, I know that it's widespread belief that it applies to all buildings. It does not. It only applies to commercial buildings, and then only a small subset, which I think probably involved all the commercial at the time, but there's nothing to prevent the council or someone else from creating new zoning districts in which that doesn't apply, because that specific language now is in the charter and is you're hamstrung to it. So that's it for the comments from our last meeting.
what about 57, 10%? Or should it be more reachable? I think that was Barbara. More reachable percentage? 57.
That is the next item on our agenda. I don't think we got to it at the last meeting. Do we want to?
Oh,
This-
well, we talked about it because I have all kinds of
Okay.
notes.
It's how many people you need to get an initiative
Yes.
going to put something on the charter.
Madam Chairman, did we, I thought
I
we
don't-
did not,
Maybe we
I don't
didn't
think we
talk
didn't
about
talk
it,
about
I
it. I
just
don't
put
believe
notes
that.
well,
down.
I also don't think we talked about 56.
56 is where we stopped last time.
Yeah, we
but
talked
We
about
ran out of
56.
juice or something.
Oh.
Before we got,
That was
We
that
did.
was where I was to provide you some backup information so you could familiarize yourself, and so that's what
Right.
that larger packet that you've got.
oh, okay, all right,
Right.
yeah, we'll go from there then.
So did you,
I wouldn't, as far as, no, I didn't make any assumptions on 57. 56, I would take the time to review the state ethics laws, and
oh, okay.
here's where I will get on my soapbox a little bit. The state ethics laws are very expansive. A lot of communities have added provisions allowing them in their charter to put in their own ethics provisions. Very few have put in actual ethics provisions in their charters. and a few that have created offices of ethics, like on the East Coast in Broward County and Palm Beach County, have started to dial back some of those. And that's because there's a significant amount of overlap and confusion between these issues. Once you start to really read through those packets, you will learn that hopefully, most of the issues that you think could be addressed have been addressed. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't violation of ethics.
Oh, yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they're necessarily reported, and the procedure for reporting that and where it goes at the state level and how that gets dealt with. But the state deals with nepotism, it deals with purchasing, it deals with a significant number of issues. And I would advise you to take a look at those issues to see if the concerns any of you might have, or if the public bring up those same concerns, whether or not they're actually already addressed. Because when we try to create that duplicative system, we run the risk that we're going to have conflicts, or we're going to make it too confusing for anyone to actually operate. It's already very confusing. I mean, to the point whenever I have an ethics, I just call the general counsel, the Commission on Ethics, and ask for an opinion, because it's just, I don't want to read something it's one of those laws that's all in the definitions, and they put the definitions, they put the rules in the definitions, which is really irritable. So take a look. If you have questions, you can email me. I'll get some additional guidance.
Could I ask a question?
Yes?
In your opinion, is this going to create a level of bureaucracy and make it less efficient overall, or is this something that might help us? In your opinion, and I mean, I know you're going to give us the legal side, but in your opinion, knowing and understanding the issue.
For a city the size of Bonita Springs, the answer is yes.
Right.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Well, some of the larger communities, some of the larger counties, they have large staffs. They also have full divisions devoted to procurement and other issues. And in my review, most of the cities it's usually counties, a couple of very large cities who have created internal offices of ethics. And they are usually dealing with things along the lines of procurement and reporting of lobbyists and things like that. So, for instance, at Lee County, every time anyone who goes to speak to any of the county commissioners, you have to log it in, you have to register as a lobbyist. There's a significant amount of paperwork, and there are people dedicated at the county level to making sure that the commissioners are dotting all those I's and crossing all those T's, and making sure that meetings are set up properly. The city of Bonita Springs does not have a lot of extra staff or the budget to create a lot of staff to man those positions. Now, because there have been so many issues with ethics in the last couple of years, there's been mandatory education programs for council members, for procurement officers. So, it's a level of moving the responsibility. And I think adding some of these extra layers may move the responsibility on the staff that they don't have the capacity to do without having a larger conversation with the council about budgeting for that.
John?
That's my opinion.
Question for Derek. Is it true also that there's a body of case law that's built up under the state ethics code, and we kind of have the benefit of that when you're trying to interpret these codes that we wouldn't have if BSU,
Absolutely. And that goes for any time you deviate from anything that's already in the state law. And that goes for the notice requirements. It goes for a lot of the things we're talking about. When you have a system, and for the state ethics code, the Commission on Ethics, you can go to their website, you can read the opinions, you can get all the forms. Everything's required in a one-stop shop. If we create our own rules, then they will be interpreted as our own rules. They won't have the guidance of all those prior decisions.
And to follow up,
Yeah, oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say, do we have any ethics issues since you've been here that you're aware of that we're consistently dealing with or have dealt with on a city basis are we making an issue that isn't there right now, is my question.
I haven't had any ethics issues come to me as city attorney since in my term.
Okay.
Now, I guess the question would be, and I hate to reflect it back on the committee, but I give you the answer. Can you add additional ethics? The answer is yes. The question is, what areas of ethics do you find that you would want to add provisions on? I guess.
Barbara?
Could I speak to that? Maybe some context background on this would be useful. When the zoning board was directed by the council to revise the zoning regulations with specific goals in mind, there was a workshop held, and at that workshop, one of the issues that was raised was whether members of the council and the zoning board should be meeting alone with applicants, for instance, that are coming asking for a zoning change before them. There was considerable considerable support for not allowing that, but there was some resistance to that. We did not, as a zoning board, that was not really within the purview of the zoning board, but at the time that we put forward what the outside attorney identified as the 4 critical things we could do right away if we wanted to improve our zoning process. One of those things was this one, it's the first one here, which would have made it against the, and I guess we would have done this as an ordinance, not as a charter change, but it would, that no member of the council or the zoning board could meet alone with a applicant before it, though they could meet with a staff person present. I think that was the sort of compromise permission that was sent forward. It is my understanding that did not pass the council. Is that right?
I believe that's correct.
Okay.
But I want to give a little more context on the issue.
Wouldn't that be covered by the state?
So many years ago, in I believe it was in Miami, there was a question, and it went up on challenge, regarding communications with council members prior to a vote on a quasi-judicial item. And the issue came out as the court found that where there had been a communication on an issue that where the council at that level was sitting as the trier of fact and of law, that they were, if the communication was not disclosed so that other parties knew that there was communication, that they were entitled to a presumption of prejudice, that basically their application had been prejudiced. Now, ultimately that went out through the districts and ultimately became the law of the land, and the case decision was Jennings. You don't need to read it, but the legislature came up with a statute to address the issue. And so what they did is they said, if you disclose those communications prior to the meeting so that the public, an adjacent property owner, any interested party has the benefit of knowing that those communications occurred and questioning the council members as to those communications to dispel any prejudice, then the prejudice is removed. The presumption of prejudice is removed. Now, whether there's actual prejudice, that would be a different story. The same statute, which is 286-0115, also authorizes local governments not to have communications at all. Now, the issue comes up, and I have always recommended that when it comes to disclosures of communications, you also should disclose your meetings with staff and your meetings with neighbors. Because oftentimes people get confused and, well, I'm not prejudiced because I didn't talk to the applicant. Yeah, but I talked to 15 people who are opposed to the project and I wouldn't talk to the applicant. Well, that sort of gives the opposite presumption. So, the advice is that I constantly give is you can have the meetings. You're allowed to have the meetings. We've not adopted an ordinance prohibiting them, but disclose as much detail as possible and have those filed ahead of time, or make notice of it at the meeting so that the applicant or an opposing party has the opportunity to cross-examine. Now, I have seen it only done a few times where they actually cross-examine a decision maker as to the nature and extent of those meetings to determine whether or not there's a prejudice. But that's the legal standard that exists now. It's typically done by ordinance. It could be done by charter.
And if I could just respond to that, because here it comes back to the thing we're all concerned about here. It's transparency that we're trying to find in our local governments in particular, and that's what we're dealing with here. And when a meeting is held with only 2 people in the room and the other parties that are interested are not there, it always raises this question, what was discussed? The idea, I think, of having a staff member present is that you have a witness. There's somebody else there with it. So it isn't just he said, she said sort of things. So that was, there are 2 approaches. What the zoning board has done, as a temporary group, as ourselves at the moment, if we have all agreed not to meet individually with applicants before us. And we did that as a matter of just zoning board policy, which the council could do itself, just as a matter of policy. But I think there's some sort of disagreement there.
I think you need a little more than just that.
Yeah.
John?
You know, I'm inclined to go in the direction our able counsel is steering us on this issue, but the question in my mind is this something we put on the list to just bring up with council?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Anything else there? Oh,
Could I
Barbara?
ask another question you made this comment, Derek, that most of the ethics comes down to a matter of definition. And here it says, these are the things on our sheet. Voting conflicts shouldn't be on the committee or advocating for something you have an interest in, which apparently state law allows you to be part of the discussion, to be part of hearing it, but as long as you recuse yourself from the vote. So the new thing here that was being suggested is that if you have a conflict, you recuse yourself from the entire proceedings. But I would like to know what exactly having an interest in or conflict means in state law here. Is it having a pecuniary interest? It must be financial of some way?
Generally, it's a special benefit. It is a pecuniary interest. There are, so in chapter 112, and probably I'm looking to see if it's tied in here. There are provisions where you have a conflict of interest and you cannot participate at all. And then there are provisions where you can participate, but generally that only applies to advisory boards, not to boards that actually have decision-making power. And then I believe the rule with respect to advisory boards still requires that the advisory board agree to allow them to participate. And that's what ends up happening. There are public officers, public employees, procurement officers, and they're all held to different standards within the ethics code. It becomes very difficult to tie which one to which one. And until very recently, which came up at the last city council meeting, there used to be what I used to like to call the no cop-out rule, which meant that council members or decision-making bodies had to vote on something unless they actually could show there was a conflict. Because sometimes there may be like 500 angry people, and I'm like, well, I think I have a conflict on this one. I can't vote. And it would occur where then you couldn't get the vote done. So that law did get changed, and so it basically said if there's a perception that there could be a conflict, you don't have to vote anymore. But that's separate from the conflict rules, which are in 112, which is the state ethics
That puts the
code.
onus on the individual. What I was asking more is, where is the conflict where the individual, it's not the individual's choice, the law says you can't do it. And that's financial interest, is that?
Financial interest generally, or familiar interest. So there are nepotism rules that apply.
That's my father.
Yeah, well, yeah, it doesn't apply to, I've learned recently, it doesn't apply to grandchildren, grandchildren-in-law, there's, it goes, there's so many degrees of separation. But I believe domestic partners have been, going to Mr. Jenkins' comment, I believe the Commission on Ethics has ruled that domestic partners fit certain roles that are outside the definitions currently, but they basically are so co-equal that they apply. Yeah, there's a significant number of rules on that, and for us to kind of go our own way, it's possible. We need to.
Well, I think
come
we
up
ought to
with-
read your
Yeah.
material, and then come back.
Madam
And it's
Chairman?
going to be on the thing with the council, but I think we really owe it to ourselves to read his material.
And
even
this
though
is,
it's
well, no,
long.
this is material put together by the Commission on Ethics, and this is the easiest read you are going to find on this subject.
Well, you've
Yes.
convinced me.
Well, I assume what this has done is incorporated some of the interpretive rulings that have happened, so you're not just reading the law and then down here at the bottom of the page, you're finding all those interpretive readings, which can be,
All right,
guess.
there's no other, is there another thing you have before I go to the next item on the agenda?
No, I don't believe so.
I don't think so. I followed you, so I think we're all right. Review our actions from February 11. And there were, what, 3 of those, I think.
So what we'll be doing for you is tracking them. So
Yeah.
we'll continue to add on to this list so that you always have each of the changes that you've made.
Right. Good.
I do have a couple of the items that the city attorney did not address that I was addressing that we haven't covered, so I can go over those.
Oh, yeah, that
You
would
ready
be
for
good.
those?
Yes, Meg.
Sure.
Please.
On the recommended changes and comments for the city charter on section 17, we have confirmed with the supervisor of elections that runoff elections are not a method of elections used in the state of Florida. So it's not an option.
Good.
On
That was the main election we were talking about, right?
Yes.
Yes.
The candidate election.
Yeah,
yes.
right.
Yep.
Right.
On section 17 regarding the history of compensation for council members, you will see in the packet, in the
Yeah.
very top section, I gave you the review of the history. In the bottom section, I gave you the information that we have received from City of Sanibel, City of Fort Myers, Villages of Estero, and City of Naples.
And that will be on the list with the council.
We can add that to the list.
Yeah.
I thought the
Yes, John?
question, I thought the question came up at the time that do council members or mayor get, if I become mayor tomorrow, do I get the benefit of the cost of living increases and start at that point versus go back? Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
So where you see it
I'm not
on
planning
the-
to run for mayor. I just don't want the-
I was gonna put it on a billboard.
So where you see it on the backup documentation, our current wages are what are effective October 1st, 2015. So
Right.
anybody coming in or current, that's where they would be.
The other question, if I may,
Yes.
that I asked last time was when was the COLA taken out? And it seems to me that that was at the time of the crunch, the 2008 crunch. But
There's kind of a two-part to that. In 2008, we went on the freeze. In 2011, 12 is when we implemented the merit-based system, which is what kind of eliminated the COLA.
Okay.
Partially eliminated, because we
But
still
didn't I
do.
read later in that, I'm sorry, I don't have a printer where I'm standing, but didn't I read later that there was some COLA back in now, or is that?
That's what, so the way the charter reads is that they get COLA based on what the employees get. So employees get merit-based annually, and then every 3 to 5 years, we do market studies, and based on the market studies, there may be a market adjustment. It was voted for council to be included in any across-the-board market adjustment that employees receive. So 2015, that's what happened. We had done a market adjustment. We had them across the board 3% to shift the market. Council was included in that.
Okay.
Right. Do you have any other items, Meg?
Yes, the last one is on the second page of the recommendation where it is asking supervisor of elections if the ballot will read changes as one whole vote or if they will be each individual vote, and it is how we send the wording to them. So if we choose to have each change as an individual referendum, it will go as an individual referendum.
Oh, that's good. Okay. Thank you.
Does that actually mean that we can lump together changes that don't relate to one another, which is specifically not allowed, though happened in the state? So we can do that. with-
I can assure you, we're not going to do that.
Yes, well, I think that's a great.
You don't
good
have to worry about that.
Oh,
All right.
I do have, I guess it's the next one.
That's it,
on.
come on.
It's actually your next item, the transitional items. that
Right.
We're asked to pull out.
Right. And there were 3.
Oh, so she's referring to the transitional section. So one of the recommendations we were asked to look at by council was to see if there was sort of dated materials that might have,
Yes.
or sections that might
Yes.
have been addressed when we actually were incorporating. So if you see in the packet attached is transitional sections of the city charter, section 7, which was previously voted on by the committee, but section 68, 70, 71, 72, these were all, could be considered transitional items of when we were first starting incorporation. So we've pulled those because the committee asked us to identify them.
Right. And we voted to remove
Section
one.
7.
Section
Yeah.
7.
Seven.
So if you wanted to take the opportunity to review those and let us know your thoughts on
Well, I think we have to go over this,
each of them.
and
No.
then,
The city manager and I also reviewed section 76, actually allows these to be removed by an ordinance voted on the city council. So it could be something that you could recommend to the city council to remove and
That's
not as a
good.
referendum.
that's good,
Because you're never
because
gonna
we don't want to
explain
make the referendum too long,
How would you ever
or they
explain
won't
that?
read it.
Right.
That's good. Okay, we
So
will
I
do
think you want
that.
to take a chance to review those and see what your recommendation might be, and that's something along the way we could forward to the city council whenever you feel appropriate for a decision on that.
Oh, good, okay. So everybody, please go over these and give us your ideas next time.
Well, now I'll comment on this because this came up once previously. People have taken issue with making changes by ordinance because it goes in conflict with what the state law says regarding revisions. This 76 was approved by referendum, these changes from the original. So this had already gone to the voters at one point to say, we can take these transitional elements out. Because I'm looking, this is not in the original state act creating the city of Bonita Springs. So this must have been added at some point in the future.
Can you talk up?
Sure. I'm just pointing out that this issue must have come before the voters of the city of Bonita Springs at one time previously, because this language is, the adoption of regular ordinance is not in the original section 76 when the city was incorporated.
So what are you saying?
So at some point, this must have been a charter amendment itself. It must have been voted as a referendum, basically allowing the council to do this by ordinance. So the concern is I know there's always question about should a decision be made to recommend a change by ordinance by city council in the charter, but apparently it appears that section 76, the elimination of transitional elements of the charter, was not in the original charter. So it's already been reviewed and voted on as a charter amendment in the past to add that section.
I'll have to look at my notes from the last time.
Yeah, because hasn't there only been just one?
No, there were two.
So there was one after 2002, that's when this incorporates, right?
And then it was like,
There's been a total of, this is the fourth charter review
Oh.
I
committee.
don't know, it went for a while,
There was two, and
right
then
in
there
a
was
row,
Yeah.
and then we waited a
10
long
years.
time, because I was chairman then.
Yeah, I didn't know there was one other than the one you had done. Because,
I've done them all.
oh, okay, well, the most recent one you did. The question that I would like to ask is, you gave us a page the first time that was about 10 things that were sent to the vote at the last one, after your last 10 years ago. And I noticed among those 10 things was not a provision that would have allowed the change of the voting date by ordinance, but that is cited in the change that was just made to move the voting date as the basis upon which the council act. And I just wondered, when was that actually voted on by the public? If it was in your time, that was not one of those, that list.
I don't remember that.
Yeah. Does it-
I don't remember that happening.
Well, that's the question I had, because that
Not
is,
that I don't remember it, I
Yeah.
don't think it happened.
yeah, and so I would like to see the basis for that claim that it was a charter amendment when it happened, and I'd kind of like to see how the people voted on that.
This was
struck-
regarding the 2010 amendments.
Yeah, because we had a summary of those 2010 amendments that you provided the
Yeah.
first day, and I carefully went through all of those, and I saw no evidence of anything that addressed changing the date of the election by ordinance. So what I want to know is when that
When
happened. Yeah.
Looks like it happened in 10. Go, Derek?
I'm going to pull it up and see if I can actually pull the actual ordinance up.
The one that was just voted?
No, no, not the ordinance, that
The
ordinance.
charter revision is what?
The charter revision ordinance.
Yeah.
Oh, don't wait on me, it might take a second.
Okay. Maybe you could tell us that next
Yeah,
time or
I'll-
something.
or I'll
or
try, if
write
I
us
can
a
get
letter
it,
or
if I can get
something.
the answer, I'll shoot it out to you right now.
Okay, what's the next? I've lost my,
2020 election development.
oh, okay. Thank you. The next item is that law, the ordinance, but not on whether the ordinance is fine or not. It's whether we want to change our date to coincide with it.
Which, yes, we had this on the agenda prior to getting a response back from the supervisor of elections on Friday on what, so the vote was to move the candidate election to November of 2020. It didn't give a response, it didn't make a vote on the charter review amendments. So we contacted the supervisor of elections to see if you guys had a choice of when you could have yours. And technically you do, but if you keep it in March 2020, you have no restrictions on how many referendums. If you move to August 2020, you have a restriction of only 3 referendums, and it's all based on ballot size and the regulations. And if you move it to November of 2020, you have a limitation of 1 referendum.
Well, I think you'll find that if we move it to that date, nobody would even see it with all the other things that are on the ballot.
And you would have lump them all in one.
And I don't think we want to do that. So it
So-
would
so
be,
the ca-
I think it should stay the same. We can see, Alan, how do you feel about that?
I would hate to see it all one. I
Lumped.
mean, that would be, people don't read it to begin, some people don't read it to begin with.
Right. Are you?
I would tend to agree with you, but I think we need to hear what the council says on this, honestly. I think this is one of those points
No,
that we
this
need to-
is us. This is us. This is not the council.
Excuse,
It re-
so just to give you some direction, when this was discussed at council, we brought up the charter review committee and they asked for your recommendation to be brought back to them.
Right.
Of when you preferred that the amendments be heard.
Okay, the amendment.
The
So when we
amendments.
prefer the amendments be heard, and the 2
Correct.
options are again?
You've got
Now,
potential,
You know,
potentially
our
3
current
options.
date
Right.
or that November date.
Okay.
No,
August.
August.
Oh,
August.
I'm sorry,
March
August.
2020, August 2020, or November 2020. August 2020, you can only have 3 referendums. November 2020, you can only have 1
One.
referendum. If you maintain the date of March 2020, which is what you originally had, you can have however many referendums that you propose.
Right.
Madam Chair, just a question. What's, that's all right.
Go on.
What's happening in August? I know March is the existing date. I know the November ballot primary, but
Primary.
what else is happening in August? One, and second, is there any downside that you see to maintaining the March date from a staff standpoint?
I worry
No,
about
they
voter turnout,
suggested the March date.
Well,
Voter
so as
turnout
far
is-
as it,
Turnout.
we're prepared.
That's what I
to-
worry
you're-
about.
Won't
Voter
get any
turnout.
voter turnout in August
Right, that's what I'm saying.
November.
or November. I mean, November, they're not even going to look at it.
March
Right,
is
but
What's
there's
the
gonna be a
latest that we can
primary,
decide this?
Yeah,
August,
that's a good
it's listed
question.
on the email. It says August is president, or
question.
primary election
Right.
ballot.
How
So,
do you
so the
feel?
August is the primary.
I think it was the
Wait,
biggest
what?
travesty.
August is
August
what?
is the primary election ballot, August, and then you have your
Oh, the
regular
Democratic and
election in
Republican.
November. But the March
Other than
22nd
presidential.
date is the presidential primary, which would be what we would be aligning
Right, we
with.
get people out.
As far as a burden or an idea of staff, we're prepared to work with whichever date. I think we were already prepared, understanding that March was the original target date for us, so,
Right.
I agree. As far as I know, the charter says the term of the council is 4 years, not 4 years and 8 months. And I think, that was a travesty. And I think
We're
we
not
need-
talking about that.
That's what we're talking about the amendments only.
Voting,
not the-
just
not when they
voting
vote.
on the amendments.
Well, yeah, we could do
You-
that in March. as
March?
well, yeah.
We could propose and
I guess my only fear is, right now, it looks like there may not be a GOP primary, and given the large GOP base down here, I worry that it's gonna be a very small turnout. There'll still be a lot of Democrats, because that'll be a very strong, election. But is there a threshold by which people vote for this stuff to pass? Because if we have 3,000 people show up and 1,500 people vote for something that stays in the city's charter forever, I just worry about having such a small base determine something that stays in the city's charter.
I think you're going to find that August, you'd have nobody.
Yeah, and we want more than
And,
one.
and November,
Yeah.
we'd have one, and people aren't even gonna read.
that
all
far
that.
down.
We need more than one.
Yeah,
I mean,
no,
we need
well,
more
So,
than
I
one.
mean,
That's why I
you-
was, yeah, if we could do more than one in November, I would, but
Well,
one
we
is
can't.
very low, so, okay, yeah.
It's
I
one
would-
or the other. It's either you only get one or you
John?
get two people
Yeah.
to come.
Yeah, I think lumping them all together in one vote in November is unacceptable.
Yeah, I do too.
I, frankly, even having a limitation of 3 in August, depending on how, may still require us to lump some together, which I consider unacceptable. So by default, I think we stick with the March date.
Yes.
Barbara?
I'd certainly go for the March date, but I wonder, is it possible, I don't know what the full power of this committee is, so I don't know whether this committee is. I agree with you. I think that the vote that was taken by the city council to change the election date, especially when you had a charter revision commission seated at the moment that could ask the people that question at an election, and certainly one of the major reasons I listened to was it was too expensive. Well, the 2020
is.
election is happening, so we could have done that. Is there any reason we couldn't pose to our citizens whether they want to change the election from March to November? I mean, it's done by ordinance, but the charter supersedes a.
May I?
Uh,
Sure, I can give a little bit.
wait a
to-
minute, let's
Sure.
have Derek speak to that.
Well, no, only to the question that Ms. Craig raised, which what is the role?
First of all, Derek, excuse me, we have a unanimous vote on the other
Okay.
to stay in March now.
Okay. The charge of the Charter Review Committee is you are an advisory committee. Your role is to review the charter, propose possible recommendations for amendments. When you have completed that process, now, outside the charter, we've set up the resolution establishing you, indicates that there'll be at least 2 public hearings on those proposed amendments. Afterwards, you'll submit your collective recommendations to the city council. The city council will consider them. They can reject them, they can approve them, they can modify them, they can add their own. And then that will go now on the March election. So you are free to make recommendations that address Section 13 on the dates of the election. It's going to be the same council that took the vote last week, so, I mean, that's where it's going to go. And real quick, as I looked at it, in 2010, the 4-year issue, as adjusted by election dates, was on the referendum. Now, the question about the 4 years as adjusted was not in the referendum question, but it was in the ordinance adopting the changes with the proposed language.
How does that language say you can, as the council, by ordinance, change the date of the election?
Well, that's our,
Is that what
actu-
we're reading adjusted?
that's
to
actually,
there?
state law already provides for that.
Okay, all right,
so-
so it's state law there.
State law provides for it. What ended up happening is I think the qualifying periods and some of those issues are still dealt with at our charter level. And so it looks like the language is just clarified because by 2010, after the 2000 election, there had been a number of changes with respect to people moving election dates to be in correspondence with presidential primaries. And if you look at the state election laws, it constantly was changing. And then some people were raising the issue, well, if a charter already provides for it and you say that charters can only be amended by referendum, so then the state legislators were saying, okay, you can change this here and you can change this there. And ultimately, after all these changes, they just got to the point where you can move your election so as long as it corresponds with a state or county-wide election. So that's sort of how we got to there.
I don't think it meant 8 months. But that's not our problem.
But it wasn't, yeah. And in the end, in this issue, I'm just reiterating what came at the council level.
Oh, that's right.
The discussions in 2010 were probably reflective of a few months, you know, moving it from January to March. But not either that or the intent or anything was put into the actual referendum or the ordinances implementing those changes. It put in only as qualified by the election date. So as I point out to city council, where would be the limit? 5 years would be the limit. You can't, there's a short end and a long end, and as I tell my little boy, I said, you're 5 until you turn 6, you know, I mean, so the hard limit that's in our charter is 4 years. Anything up to that, the language says it can be adjusted by election dates.
If you
I'm
could
lost.
Yes.
have
That's
a
okay, I'm
official
lost.
motion on your recommendation
Yes.
for the 22nd.
I'd
and
like
then-
to have a motion made to accept the March date.
I'll make a motion to accept.
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And we will forward that
Opposed?
recommendation to council.
Good. And next,
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
that's all right, my fault. I've lost my agenda.
Public comments,
We don't need public comments.
next, oh, wait a minute. That's the last one. Where did I put this? Here you go.
The joint city council meeting date?
Oh,
Joint
yeah.
City Council.
Joint date, what do you recommend?
Well, I think you all would like to move a little bit further with some of these answers
Oh, yeah.
back. So
Yeah.
we can just place this on the next agenda.
Oh, okay.
So we want to keep it as a placeholder so we can
Oh,
continue. We
okay.
want to make sure you're comfortable before we begin
Okay.
to ask for the joint
Okay.
meeting.
That's good.
But on some of these, we'll report back to them, for example, that we've made a decision on the 22nd. We'll report that
Right.
back to them now.
Right.
Madam Chair, actually, I did notice one more thing from my notes that an
Oh,
item I was going to
okay.
bring back to you, which
Okay.
was the question of whether or not the charter should be amended so that there's a requirement for 2 meetings every month. You asked me to look and see what other communities had for charter provisions, because Lee County, a lot of other communities take off a month during the summer. The only other community in Lee County that has a provision regarding the number of meetings, none of them have any provisions except for Fort Myers Beach.
Oh.
So, you know, and Fort Myers Beach is only every other month required, so no less than 8 meetings in a year. We're the only ones that have a requirement for regular monthly meetings.
All right, we'll look that up. And I think we should put that on the agenda. Can I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make the motion to adjourn.
Second? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?